are going to be exploring the science behind Indian cooking in an ISF book talk. If I could please request Suchitha Champak, the interviewer of the session, to turn on her audio and video. And of course, we have Krish Ashok with us, the writer of the book, who has joined in. Thank you to you both for coming on board India Science Festival, and we're so excited to hear more about the book and the process behind it, because this is a topic that I really think hasn't been explored previously, and it's great that we've gotten the opportunity to host you both at ISF. So Suchitha, over to you. Please take this session forward, and to all our attendees, please feel free to drop in questions for Krish in the Q&A tab, and he'll take them towards the end of the session. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much, Shruti, for inviting me to take this session on. It's my pleasure to be here today and have this exciting conversation with Krish Ashok. Hi, Ashok. It's a pleasure to have this chat with you. And I love your Zoom background. Yes. I know this, this fireside chat and the purpose to have this informal conversation about your book and how you thought about it while you wrote it and all of that. But today I want to start this conversation on a very, very serious note. I am now seriously reflecting on how my life decisions will be influenced by this book and how my persona evolves amongst my family. I mean, yes, you got it right. The so-called plan for tomorrow, you are going to be doomed if you haven't thought about it every day. That is what and how I should cook for my breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And about my evolving persona, yes. Well, thank you so much for making me wiser in front of my mom and mother-in-law from this book. Thank you so much, Krish. Yeah.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
All of you all, yes. For all of you all today, I mean, this is the drift of how the book goes, and it's so much fun to read, and it's such a stimulating book that it certainly needs to sit on a shelf of its own on my kitchen. So I'm going to try and layer our conversation how Ashok has taught us to layer and get the most delicious biryani out from your kitchen. Thank you so much, Krish. It has evoked a lot of nostalgia from working as a researcher, and what our reference books and lab notebooks look like. It's a testament to applying the knowledge of science to satiate your taste buds and that of your families. So you introduce this book as an attempt to introduce an engineering mindset into Indian cooking with the ultimate aim of making the reader a better cook and turning the kitchen into a joyful and creative laboratory for culinary experiments. So I'm curious to know how and why you conceptualize this topic over all the gazillion topics you could have just chosen to write about as an engineer or as a musician. And of course, how being an engineer and musician has helped you author this book. Tell us a little more.
So obviously, I think, first, this thing is that although I studied engineering, I ultimately, been working in software for almost 22 years now. And in a sense, it's interesting, right? So it's the kind of engineering thinking that helps you do better at software, because it's the same meta principles that apply in software engineering, except you're not actually dealing with wires and cars and, the messy stuff, but you're just really dealing with code. The other reason, obviously, is that the first part of obviously writing any book, before you start writing, is the hard conversation of why are you writing this, and who will buy the book. I think the second one is probably more important. Who's the audience and why will they buy it? And given that it was the pandemic, and it was just in early 2020, the pandemic had just started, and clearly the publishing industry wasn't doing too well, and so they were quite picky and choosy about what might sell and what might not sell and so on. And so the first goal was to try and find clearly something that had not been written about, right? Because then it adds novelty, right? The second thing is, should your audience therefore just be a very narrow specialist audience, or can you potentially write, and go for a wider audience? The latter is often very hard to do, right? Especially for science communicators, because it's very easy for science communication to keep the scientists happy and keep the communication exactly just just purely just explain their jargon in exactly those terms, state all the caveats they state in their white papers, and call that science communication. But unfortunately, that's not how people need stories. People need simpler models, if you will. And I think sometimes scientists don't like that. So clearly the idea was to say, no, don't write for nerds, don't write for engineers. Okay, so don't write for your target audience that you've always been comfortable in your life. Young men working in IT, right, who don't know how to cook, write a book for them would have been a relatively easy thing to do. More jokes, more science, more equations, all the usual stuff and so on, right? And I think the folks at Penguin really nudged me to say, no, aim for a wider audience. And I think that's what, in that sense, I have to give them credit to say that they actually gave me a challenge, saying that, look, all your copy editors are arts and humanities students who have hated science all their lives because of terrible teachers in school and terrible textbooks. If you can write a book that demystifies the thing that they're already good at, which, by the way, again, the goal was to say that most people already know cooking. You don't need to understand science to know cooking. All our grandmothers and mothers and everyone else intuitively knows what happens. They may not understand the science behind it. So one, you'd explain that without seeming like patronizing and saying that, hey, this is how it works. Your idea is wrong. You're explaining what they already know in a language, in the model that they understand. That then gives them ideas to apply it, in further ways, and they find it useful and so on. And two, more importantly, not talk down to them. Don't presume that they understand the terms that you use and so on. And so really keep it first principles, right? And do all of that and keep it to under 250 pages, because anything larger than that does not sell, right? So I think, so these were the considerations. And I think, the start of the pandemic, everybody wanting to cook, everybody wanting to learn to cook, more people wanting to learn to cook, ended up being the right time, if you will. And it's just got fortunate. So, book came out at the right time, and, it's done very well and so on. I think you're on mute, Suchitha. Yes.
Yeah. So do you want to take a minute to talk about the name and how, why you decided to call it Masala Lab, and the tagline?
Yeah, no. So obviously I think, so since we aimed for a general audience, we were taking this big risk of trying to, because, it's either a hit or miss, right? Because, you're going to publish more, you're going to keep it paperback, and you're going to reach out. In sense, the upfront spend is a lot more. They had to pay a lot more attention to the name. And so, in fact, I think the first draft of the name was Masala Laboratory. How science and engineering can help you make a better biryani was the tagline. So that was actually the tagline. And then obviously the marketing folks said, boss, okay, it's too big, etc. Let's shorten it. So laboratory became lab. And then my editor said, just keep it the science of Indian cooking. After she read the draft, she said, okay, fine. Let the biryani thing be the final, the dessert, if you will. But keep the name really simple, and be ambitious, right? So the idea is to say this is the science of Indian cooking because it hasn't been written about. So I think you can boldly lay claim to the fact that you're writing about the science of Indian cooking. So, and so I think, that's how we kind of went with a very simple, bold and ambitious name. I mean, if the book had not done well, it would have seemed silly in retrospect. But yes, so that's how the name came about. And I think in a sense, I think the word masala in a sense is also reasonably universal, right? In a country that has thousands of languages. And terminology for ingredients vary by language, right? And I'm very particularly, as a South Indian, I'm particularly wary of trying to go for the usual thing of using a Hindi name that then assume that it is national and so on. But even within that word, masala is a term that everybody across India recognizes. It's one food term that's genuinely universal, right? And so that's why we sort of went with masala, and then lab was obviously natural.
Awesome. So, I mean, being the science communicator that I am, I really want scientists, researchers, and also aspiring science communicators to really make note of the subtle things that you've noticed and, put in your book, just about, how you figure out your audience, you profile their persona, and just make sure that they are in that safety net and they really learn something very new, right? So, and also I really want to acknowledge how lucid and creative this book is in explaining concepts and applying them even. So I want to discuss a little bit about your writing style and how you developed this persona for audience, right? So, I mean, you did mention this, but, the book really cracked me up at instances. I sat with the book reading and laughing by myself, and then also, had my eyebrows raised and oh, okay, this is an interesting analogy, and even go oh, this this is how it works, right? So, I mean, I want to like give a little bit of context to the audience if they still haven't read the book, maybe pick up a couple of the instances that you have in your book. So here is one place where Ashok talks about how meat can get contaminated by bacteria, but he's not used the word contamination because that can evoke different meanings and also probably not be understood, right? So, he says that leaving the meat at room temperature for too long is a welcome to the free all you can eat buffer neon signboard for traveling bacteria. I mean, like, these are some things that I really enjoyed in your book. And also a very interesting thing about perception of flavor through your nose, right? So, and here you give an analogy of saying that despite the fact that 80% of the flavor perception that happens through the nose, we tend to associate the tongue to being the Watson and Crick of flavor to the nose's Rosalind Franklin, right? So, I mean, I couldn't have thought about it. And also, if you don't really understand or know both the sides of the science and the people, you can't really put these two together, right? So, I mean, so as a writer, how do you see breaking down these concepts in science and packaging them in these interesting, relatable yet fun blocks in your book?
So if I think about how I learned science and engineering in general, and having that's one side, and the other side is obviously my journey as a writer, which I've been doing since I was young and so on. So learning science for me, at least, growing up in the Indian sort of schooling system and so on, most science education is quite terrible in the sense that I think in many cases the textbooks and the way it's taught does not focus on first principles at a level, simply because I don't think teachers have the time. They're overworked, they're underpaid. Let's not blame them. But I think it's so basically a lot of our school teaching essentially targets the naturally smart 10% of the class. That's really it. All the rest are just simply left behind. So they just go through it, and then in class 10 they just give up and say, "Fine, science is not for me, right? Mathematics is not for me." So this sort of obsession with, and because as someone who's always been very poor at memorizing stuff, my way of learning has always been, if I cannot understand it all the way up to first principles, then I don't understand it, right? And so that's always been an obsession. And so in a sense that because I couldn't memorize stuff, so I wouldn't memorize equations and so on. I would try and derive them from first principles, which obviously sometimes cost me time in examinations and all of that. But that's just always how I learned, right? The second aspect is that writing for me has always originally come from, all through school and college, writing humor, right? So I used to have a blog that I, in the early days of the internet, that was largely a humor blog, right? And so on. So humor writing for me has always been a way for me to communicate difficult ideas. And I think often good humor is essentially about finding good analogies. Okay. Now, actually, the interesting thing is that when it comes to science communication, and as a science communicator, you know this, analogies are dangerous, okay? because analogies are necessarily oversimplifications. Okay. So in a sense, you're actually taking what is the original model, which is a very complicated one. You're actually taking another model that is easier for people to understand. But by the way, along the edges, it may have a lot of things that don't quite necessarily describe the full complexity of what's going on. But in science communication, you often have to say, I think that's good enough. It's like deciding whether teaching someone to drive a car is merely saying, press accelerator, move the car, press brake, stop the car, is the one model. The other model is exactly how petrol comes into through the carburetor, air comes through the carburetor into the engine, and petrol, it ignites, and then there is a 4-stroke, 2-stroke engine. So you could argue that the person who understands how the engine works is better, can maybe repair the car and save some money, right? You can make that argument. But 99% of people may not need to know that, right? So I think for me, a lot of it's my experience in writing humor, and not necessarily always in science, right? The idea of humor, again, I would argue, has a lot of parallels to good science communication, because humorists and stand-up comics and others essentially use analogies to tell you to explain difficult concepts that you would otherwise just think it's a lecture. it's like saying, it's when somebody says, oh, there is privilege in society, there is, economic inequality. That's a lecture. Nobody cares about that, right? But when a stand-up comic explains the same thing using an analogy or a story to highlight that fact without actually saying it, then people are far more likely to understand and appreciate, which is why humor plays such a critical role in society, right? And it is also why authoritarian societies tend to clamp down on humor, right? So in a sense, I think I wish science communicators, part of science communication training ought to be how to write humor, because I think you become a better communicator. You find better analogies. You're going to piss off some scientists because they might think, oh, you're oversimplifying, but then scientists will always think you're oversimplifying, right? But that's not the point. The job of the communicator is to reach the end audience, right? And I think so and so your example of the contamination one, right? It would have been easy for me to say contaminate, right? But then in my mind, the way I thought about it is that actually the correct way to think about food is that there is no binary between contaminated and pure. Okay. And that's not how it works. Okay. There are just billions and trillions. There is more bacteria in a cup of yogurt than there are human beings in India. Okay. And so when you think on those scale, it is only it's a spectrum, right? There is always bacteria. Okay. It is only when it reaches a point when it ferments it to the point where you don't like the taste of it. Okay. Is when you think it is contaminated, right? And again, mind you, lacto fermentation by bacteria almost always it results in stuff that you can still eat, right? It's only fungal pathogenic bacteria, salmonella, or the ones like other fungi, hairy fungi and all, which will release toxins as essentially again as a way of saying, now this food is mine. It's not anyone else's. Here's the poison, right? So it's that way. So in that sense, when you essentially recognize that what you consider contaminated is food for someone else, is in the larger ecology and food chain. So I felt that using for the traveling bacteria, here's a free for all buffet, is a better and actually a more accurate way of saying than simply saying contaminate, right? I think it's easy to be precise, but I think it's harder to tell a good story with a model that actually is richer, if you will. Yes, but knowing fully well that if you're a scientist, that model is obviously not good enough, right? And you need to be ultra precise and so on. But I think that's the balance that you have to sort of take as a science communicator.
Absolutely. That's a very fine line that you have to make sure you don't cross. Right. So you've raised two very important points of conversation that I really want to elaborate a little on, but let's pick up the first one, right? So after reading this book, which has such rich flavor of science and saliva inducing adjectives, I've sort of challenged myself to use adjectives that set today's theme, right? So do excuse me if I put myself in a soup here. So, but yeah, so you've been very deliberate about introducing and patiently explaining these scientific terminologies, fundamentals, and principles of physics and chemistry, right? So, the science communicator in me just couldn't stop but appreciate how you've simplified the knowledge and put it in a structured manner. It could be the pictorial representations, tables, flowcharts, or even the meta model concept of making gravies, breads, etc. Thinking in terms of Metamodels, like you mentioned in the book, is a concept of science and engineering, but you've adapted it to cooking. So talk to us a little bit more about why this kind of thinking, in cooking too, it makes a difference.
Yeah. So it's actually quite interesting in that while we kind of like to think that the idea of Metamodels is a very modern day science and technology engineering led way of knowledge representation, right? And it makes sense, right? It's when you create a model, it describes a narrower set of phenomena than a meta model, which describes a wider set of phenomena, right? Because you can derive models from it, and then those models then explain other things. And so the goal of good knowledge representation and teaching, etc., has always been to be able to create meta models, right? And that's been the fundamental goal of science in a sense, right? But in reality, if you go talk to a seasoned chef or somebody grandmother who's been cooking for 70, 80 years and so on, they think in terms of meta models. They actually don't think in terms of recipes. When I at least, I'm sure this is reasonably universal. I've spoken to at least 50 or 60 different people while I was writing the book, all of them old women who great cooks, right? and not a single one of them really thought in terms of recipes, right? They always thought in terms of heuristics. They said, oh, this is a rice-based dish. And so for rice-based dishes, I need to worry about consistency. So the amount of water, the amount of time, salt. I know at this point it might stick. And at this point it's cooked and I need to soak for this long. And so they're almost naturally thinking about heuristics and metamodels, right? But I think what is unfortunate is that because of the Indian subcontinent's sort of long history of not documenting anything, okay, largely because of the oral tradition and so on. And two, it's actually quite interesting. We have recipe books from the Sumerian civilization in cuneiform. So we know precise cooking instructions from 5,000 years ago in Sumeria. You can barely count 2 or 3 books on cooking in the Indian subcontinent, right? With any kind of detail. Okay. Right, the same one book called Masala from the 12th century will keep coming up, saying that that's about the only thing, right? There are a few things that are Ayurvedic in nature, or really focused on medicine rather than cooking, but largely there are no pure cooking as a pleasure is something that is a very much a later phenomenon, right? Only from the Mughals did people start to write books on cooking, okay? Otherwise, it is always about medicine. Okay? Now, and the second fact is that, again, a lot of this heuristic knowledge is in the heads of women, again, because of patriarchy. They're the ones who are cooking. Until one generation ago, no access to education. So obviously, nothing has been written. And the first generation of people writing down these things literally were only writing down recipes, because that was the easy thing to do, right? And nobody stopped to think that actually a recipe is a very limiting way of capturing meta models. It's a great way of capturing one instance of one way of cooking one dish in that particular house, right? It's no grandmother saying, oh, half a teaspoon more of cardamom will change the recipe. Is not how they're thinking, right? They're thinking in terms of, oh, I'm going to use whatever spices I have. I'm going to open the fridge and see what I have. And then I'm going to make whatever I have. And that is essentially how people think, right? So I think in that sense, the idea of this book was to say, well, no, I think the ideal way is to think about how your grandmother thought about cooking and represent that as a meta model, rather than say that, oh, I invented this new fantastic meta model way of, thinking about cooking. So in a sense, I think, it's really to say that's how your grandparents thought about it, right? It's just the internet has forced, and cookbooks have forced you to think that there is purity, there is authenticity, there is one single recipe. That's not true. That's not how cooking works.
Yeah. I mean, I am in awe of how you've compiled all of this in such an engaging package, for anyone to consume, right? I've seen a few people online, like you mentioned, it could be blogs or even the YouTube videos talk about recipes and what techniques should be used. Some of them do mention that, but you take it to the next level and describe why the technique works at the chemical, physical, and even the psychological levels, right? So I would like to actually again quote something that I found very interesting. So again, to bring to perspective, this is an excerpt from the section called Science of Vegetables, where you talk about flavor, right? So here you mention about how flavor tends to be a function of how strong the plant's defense mechanisms against predatory munchers are, right? So if a plant is exposed to more pests, it will use more of its resources to defend against them and thus be more flavorful. And this is why, organic produce is more flavorful than non-organic, inorganic produce, right? So, building this thought process on how things work the way they do takes some discipline, observation, and even practice, right? You also have mentioned this in your methodology section towards the end. So how can one develop such a perspective? So do you want to elaborate a little bit on that section there?
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to how when I was learning science in school, I again, privilege, and I was fortunate to have uncles and others who were scientists and who were obviously, and people who are good teachers in a sense, right? And in fact, one of my cousins, elderly cousins, was someone who graduated with a degree in the IIT, but then skipped the corporate thing and became a physics teacher. Because again, he recognized that I think to make science more joyful for people, you have to teach it in that way. And often, every time he would meet, he would just ask us questions about, okay, what did you learn in school? And I would say, oh, by the way, we learned about static electricity today. And what about it? And he would say that, oh, by the way, we learned that, charge tends to collect at sharp edges of stuff, right? Of any sharp edge. That's why a comb tends to collect more static electricity, and your hair kind of stands up with you, and so on. Carpets, which again have these thin, sharper edges, tend to collect, and so on. And he was like, "Why do you think so?" Right? And that question, and I said, I don't know. I don't. And I tried finding books that kind of explained why this happens, etc. So, which is why I think, when I wrote that first chapter, right, which is the toughest chapter to write, I recognize, for example, saying that it's one thing for me to say that, by the way, this is what happens, when you cook in water versus when you cook directly on a pan versus when you cook in an oven. But unless I genuinely am able to explain to the audience what the difference is between convection, conduction, radiation in the context of, say, a microwave and so on. But even in school, you would only stop there. Oh, there are these ways of transferring heat. There is radiation, there is convection, there's conduction, right? So I said, well, how do I make it more intuitive, right? So as you say, look, if it's a solid, it's heavier. There's more mass. More mass means there's more atoms, right? So when you impart energy to it, it is just going to keep vibrating, and then there's more of it. It's going to hit against your food, and then it's going to transfer heat to it, right? Because there's more stuff, there are more atoms. In a liquid, there are fewer atoms, so therefore the heat transfer is a lot more slower, and so therefore it tends to be, there are currents of heat that tends to flow. And really, again, in a gas, very, very few molecules. So again, that's why 100 Celsius on a metal pan will burn your finger. 100 Celsius in water will feel pretty hot, but 100 Celsius oven, you can just put your hand in and you won't feel anything at all. To kind of, bring that idea of, look, I think it is, if you understand this, you can apply it in cooking really, really well. You'll understand intuitively why it takes 40 minutes to bake a bread, but literally 30 seconds to fry a puri in hot oil at 170 Celsius. That's the difference metal and temperature bakes, right? And why we use fats, for example, right? The only reason we use fats is not because they chemically react with your food, is because it's the only liquid that stays liquid at temperatures high enough above the boiling point of water, right? You can't fry a puri in water because water boils at 100 Celsius, and the reactions we want in between the proteins and the sugars happen at 110 and above, right? And that's why we use fat. So you take oil, which only boils only at 200 Celsius or so. So you're able to then transfer heat evenly. The direct metal will not transfer it evenly, because again, you can visualize it that ultimately no surface is perfectly smooth. So it's going to be jagged. So your food rests on that metal. There is no perfect contact. So the heat transfer is not even, right? So it is essentially this sort of obsession with really keep asking why till you, as much as possible, perhaps not down to the quantum level, but at least at the level of, at the molecular or the atomic level, or at the basic aggregate thermodynamics level, in few situations is very useful as a heuristic, which you can apply generally. You don't have to understand the equations. You don't have to understand the actual measurements and so on. But broadly, understand that, look, food is ultimately about applying heat in a controlled manner, right? And that you have all these materials. These materials act in different ways when it comes to heat, right? Liquids are different from solids and so on. And I think it is essentially that I felt that the first principles approach also makes it more accessible to someone who perhaps did not have the opportunity to have a good science education when they were younger, or did not have someone who could explain it to them, like, for example, the way my elderly cousin did in my case. So I think that was the thought process.
Thank you so much, for introducing first principles at very nicely to people, right? So I'm so glad you've thought about it in that sense. And also it's very, very nice to understand and think about how cooking and how, I was just sold at the point where you started the book with the science of water. H2O, and I know how it reacts, but the way you explained it was just beautiful. So so let's just take a little bit of a shift over here in this conversation. I just want to touch upon this topic, and then we'll move on to a lot of interesting questions that we have here. So you've touched upon some important misconceptions and pseudoscience practices being practiced in the kitchen, right? So you talk about how useful ingredients like sodium bicarbonate or monosodium glutamate are, and how words like fats or acid have gotten really bad PR in our households, right? So do you have any real life instances where this bad PR has sort of clouded conversations around food with friends or family, and how did you like tackle it?
Yeah, no, so I think typically, I think your one particular area I'm finding it very hard to convince people is baking soda, right? I think people for some reason have associated baking soda as being, one, therefore chemical. Okay. It's very hard to sometimes tell people that salt is sodium chloride. It's also a chemical, right? Actually, ultimately everything is chemical. And your body doesn't know the difference between natural sodium chloride and artificial sodium chloride. All salt comes from, it's just sodium and chlorine, and whether it was came from the sea. By the way, all salt ultimately came from the sea. It's just either ancient seas or modern day seas. Okay, that's really all there is to it. Okay, and often I think so, but at the end of the day, I think it's recognition also as a science communicator that that your job is not to prove other people wrong. Okay, your job is to understand why they believe what they believe, and then be able to find a model of explaining it to them that doesn't insult their current understanding. Right? I think that's a very, very important. So I've sort of recognized very early that talking down to people is not good communication. Right?
Absolutely.
It's fine. I find that a lot. I think particularly people who are fortunate enough to understand science essentially spend their time on social media finding people who don't, and then feeling good about dismissing them, right, or mocking them, right. So in a sense, I think you have to recognize that food is the only foreign object that we willingly put inside our body every day. Okay, and again, so if you understand how biology works and how it's sort of the self-contained, a recursive loop, as Douglas Hofstadter puts it, right, in terms of consciousness and all that. But at the end of the day, it's this sort of phenomenally complex system with so many checks and balances, and you're constantly throwing these new things at it every day, right? And the system has to extract nutrients, it has to throw out the waste, and it is not surprising that, and again, since as far back as our mammalian evolution goes, that paying attention to what you eat and paying attention to what you don't eat is wired into us. Okay, so you cannot simply go and tell someone to suddenly say, throw in this powder that doesn't taste very good. Okay,
yes.
I assure you, it's absolutely safe. Is you are going against millions of years of evolution. If you can convince a dog to eat something that it does not like eating, it does not work. Try giving a dog medicine for starters, right? It doesn't work. So I think you have to come at it from that point of view, saying that, hey, I can explain what the advantages are, and I can perhaps slowly sort of guide you into saying, why don't you try a quarter teaspoon when you bake, when you cook chana, for example, right? It's usually a very easy way to introduce baking soda. Then they realize that, oh, by the way, I managed to cook the chana in half the amount of time, and it was much softer, right? And it doesn't taste too bad. And that's a starting point for saying, hey, you know what? This happened because of the baking soda, because baking soda broke down the pectin, which all plant cell walls are made of, and I think it therefore hastened the cooking process, right? And I think so I think that is the sort of idea of how you think about misconceptions. The second thing is that food is so central to people's identity. Again, these are not scientific subjects; these are anthropological things, which I think it's important for science communicators to understand. Food is central to identity, right? What you eat is a function of which religion, which part of the world, which caste, which community you grew up in, right? And then because of the way our brains are wired, what you grew up eating as a child forever affects what you end up liking later in life. That's just how it works, right? And so you can't, it's very hard for someone who's never eaten fish all their lives to suddenly start eating fish much later. They just simply cannot get over the smell of trimethylamine, which smells very bad. Okay, and so on. So the point is that I think it is really about that empathy of understanding that the reason people believe in misconceptions is for a lot of reasons, and you have to be able to recognize that to be able to get through to them. So I think that's an important point there.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you've done it very, very nicely in the book, and of course, I mean, to be honest, I have had challenges, introducing these, ingredients, of course, in very small quantities that we need, right? Yeah. So I think it's an everyday learning for us and to people whom we converse with, right? So, and it's a continuous learning process. So in relation to that, we have one question from an attendee who asks if you have observed similarities and stark differences in the science of cooking through different parts of the country, since we have diverse cultures, or are the baseline fundamentals the same? I mean, yeah.
So it turns out that at least the basic science of way a lot of subcontinental food tends to work, and again, as I say this in the preface of the book, not including obviously certain very specific areas that have historically never gotten recognition. Northeastern food in Northeastern India, food perhaps of Adivasis who live in tribal and in these hilly communities and who have their different ways. Some of them may still be hunter-gatherers and so on. The typical sort of middle-class style cooking, largely from what I can see, varies in taste and flavor, primarily from the choice of fat and early spices that you use. That essentially is what gives the bulk of the flavor comes from that, right? Because spice flavor molecules tend to be fat soluble. That's why almost all cooking begins or ends with heating some kind of fat, adding spices. The spices, all the spice flavor molecules dissolve into the hot oil, and it's that oil that is flavoring the food, right? That's the bulk of the flavor, the bulk of the aroma, right? And it's right. So essentially, regardless of you can take any ingredients, and then you take mustard oil, and then you take a combination of fenugreek, mustard, celery seeds, nigella seeds, and fennel, right? No matter what you do, it will taste Bengali. Okay. And if you take, coconut oil and curry leaves, ginger, garlic, and something like that, it will taste Malabar, right? If you take red chilies, there's something called kalpasi, which is a lichen that's used as a spice flavoring in Chettinad areas and so on. It will taste Chettinad, right? So at the end of the day, I think, it's that sort of generalized realization that, a bulk of these kinds of day-to-day dishes, and again, as I said, snacks and starters and desserts have 100 times more diversity than the staple foods. Staple foods tend to be either wheat-based, millet-based, or rice-based. And the gravy, you either have a dry dish or a gravy dish. We are really just talking about this. This tends to the basic science of it, the basic the chemistry landscape is broadly similar. Only varies in terms of what spices you use, what fats you use. All the rest is largely the same.
This is like one of the biggest learnings or takeaways that I can take personally from this book, because I've been, whenever I cook a gravy or a curry, I realize that it's mostly Punjabi and haven't really tried any other cuisine, right? So maybe now we try a different combination of spices, and then you get something very interesting with the same ingredients, right? So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, Southeast Asia is very similar, which is why I think one of the examples I gave in this thing is that, look, if you use galangal, shallots and Thai basil, and those sort of fish sauce and so on, and use that to make the spice paste and cook your rice in coconut milk and so on, you can make a Thai biryani actually. Right? You can still use the same techniques, but you can get a biryani that has a Thai-like flavor profile, right? So which is why it is basically say that's what differentiates a Kolkata biryani from a Ampur biryani from a Malabar. There are already so many variations of biryani. People wondering, this is real, this is authentic. No, boss. Biryani is the truly one national dish because there is one variant everywhere, every street, every house. Okay, so it belongs to no one, right? It has influences from Persia to Southeast Asia, but it is genuinely the one. It is sort of mishmash of everything. But that's the thing about Indian food, is that it is over history. It has been the greatest cuisine that has adapted influences from everywhere, right? I think there was somebody in Britain actually once said that you can't actually introduce the Indians to new methods of cooking. You can introduce new ingredients, but they will turn it into Indian food. Okay,
absolutely.
Right? So you take pav bhaji. The pav is Portuguese. The potato is South American. The capsicum is Mexican. The tomatoes and chilies are Mexican. Carrots and beans and cauliflowers were introduced by the British. There is not a single ingredient in pav bhaji that is of Indian origin other than the spices. And even there, you can argue that the cloves and nutmeg actually came from Indonesia originally. So the point is but pav bhaji is still uniquely Indian. Okay. So that's the brilliant part. None of the ingredients are ingredient, but it's uniquely Indian. Yeah.
Just by uttering the phrase Thai biryani, you have just frowned a lot of these hardcore biryani lovers. But I'm sure after they read your book, they're just going to enjoy, the essence as much, right? So now let me just put shift the conversation a little bit on the back end of the book itself, because we have a lot of the questions coming from there. So there are questions like, how you wrote this book, like, did you interview anyone, and how much time did you take to complete this book? So, and how did the publishing go about? And yeah, some more insights on that.
So I think so. How long it took to write the book? Again, don't go by. So it took me about 6 weeks to write the book. Okay, so if that seems too short, and again, it's because I've obsessively documented my cooking, my daily cooking, since I was about 20 or 22 years old. Okay, so I have so I do have said, oh, I tried chapati today, and I tried 50% hydration. It turned out very dry. So the next time I would try 60%. So it is just that I have notes of all of this going back almost, 15, 16 years. And so in a sense, a lot of these heuristics I already was already there in my mind, right? It's just that nobody had said, why don't you put it all in a book? Okay. So it's just that it was the act of writing this book was more an exercise in choosing what to leave out, what would be too much, what would be just a show off of knowledge rather than actually practically be useful for someone. That was the harder part. And that's, I think, where the editing process helped, right? And I think you mentioned the humor. The editor took out about 80% of all the jokes. And she said, no, this joke is not universal. This is too specific to Chennai. Nobody will understand it. This is too science fiction. Remove it. And so what you're actually seeing is only 20% of the jokes that were left behind in the book.
You have to read
she allowed me one Chennai joke, and which the one temperature at what things happen at what temperature, right? 0, water freezes at sea level and so on. 29 Celsius is when Chennai declares winter, right? So any temperature below 29 Celsius is Chennai winter, right? And so on. So at 62 degrees, eggs begin to set, and that and so on. So I think that was the writing process. So again, it was the fact that I'd already taken down so many notes and so on. Second, obviously, is I used a tool called Scrivener that allowed me to think of the book outside in, meaning that I can first lay out the book and say, this is the table of contents, and these are the chapters, and these are the sub-chapters, and then start dragging and dropping all the relevant material into the notes section against that sub-chapter. Then set a daily target and say 3,000 words a day, look at all the research material, write 3,000 words, and then keep doing that, and then do a round of editing it down, paring it down, etc., etc. And at some point, keep sending it to the editor, and then they come back with saying that I don't understand this. This is not very clear. This is too sciencey, and so on. And then sort of go from there, right? So that was the larger editing process per se. But I think the overall publishing process itself, as I said, it took less time to write the book and 5 or 6 months of actually editing the book, right? To really carefully look at it line by line and seeing if there's any point when you lose some audience. And I think that's where the editing process is important, right? You have to keep the reader engaged, and you can't lose them. You can't, and if at any point it's sort of a vanity exercise in showing off, you will lose the reader. You will lose some readers. You think it's the people who think exactly like you might agree with you, but your audience is bigger than people who think like you, right? And so I think that was the harder part, right? And I think. And in equal measure, I think in the modern sense of the word, I think the idea was to think more visually, which is why a lot of the illustrations and so on, which we knew again had to be designed in such a way that we knew that independently people would say, hey, take a photo of that illustration and say, hey, I found this hilarious thing in this book, right? And they would share it on social media, right? So you want to upfront think of things that have the potential to go viral on social media. Between the last 1 year, thousands of people have shared that Chennai declares winter at 29 Celsius table. And I think that one single illustration has probably sold more books than anything else, right? So then people get, sort of work. Oh, that's interesting. So, and also the electromagnetic spectrum, where I, include a few other jokes and so on, right? So which is why I said I kept the jokes out of the writing and kept them in the illustrations, because, that's an easier place to sort of keep it and so on. So that was obviously the writing, editing, and the publishing process itself. And I think largely a lot of the world of writing today, it tests tend to, it's not just a fact of writing a book. You have to be on social media, you have to be on YouTube, you have to be on Instagram, you have to be, in fact, I was not on Instagram. And my editor said, look, unfortunately, I know you may not like Facebook as a platform, but all cooking and food happens on Instagram. That's where you need to be. And so literally 2 weeks before the book went live, I created an Instagram account called _Masala Lab, because by then Masala Lab had been taken by someone else. And then I started posting, interesting things related to the book. I started posting cooking videos. And I think my advantage of being a musician as well. So I started posting recipe videos where I would compose music specifically for that recipe video. And so it ended up being a good, fun activity, if you will. I would explain the science, and then I would shoot the video in such a way that critical elements, like when you pour the tadka, there would be a critical sort of climax in the music and so on. So that was so I just started using my Instagram handle for that, and now it's sort of not bad. It's gone up to about 16,000 followers, and largely again I use it for day-to-day science communication. I look at all the notes that I took, things that I didn't write in my book, and that I once in a while share those things on Instagram and so on. So as I said, I think being a writer in today's world is not in the older sense of the word of you find a publisher, go on some lit fest, do some events, go sign some books, and that's not the world today, right? The world today is that the life of an author begins well before you write the book. You need social media presence, you need credibility. That's credibility, not institutional credibility, right? So there are no gatekeepers anymore, right? You can be a science communicator on Twitter and Instagram, on LinkedIn, and all of these things, and build that credibility. And then you're going to sustain that. And there has to be a life beyond just the book, right? And there has to be things that you can do to clarify, do podcasts and so on. I think so. That's the sort of world, if you will.
Totally. And like on these lines, I'd like to quote one of the, attendees of this chat, Aditi, where she is an Amazon Prime member, and she happened to, bookmark this book for buying in the future. And then, today she got an email saying that there's a talk around this book. So which is, yep. I mean, that's the power of social media, right? So, and also communication beyond like institutional credibility. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I would actually want to ask this last one question before we wrap up. And I want you to tell us a little bit about what do you think about public engagement platforms such as the India Science Festival, and how your experience has been.
I think this is fantastic, right? There needs to be more science communication, and it is good. And I, in the past, I used to find a lot of these things to be just sort of mutual back scratching by people in science, just sort of talking to each other and not really making an effort to talk to a wider audience, and so on, right? Because I think the world outside of the scientific world is very different. I think people think differently. People, many things that we take for granted, or that, of course, this is pseudoscience and so on. People don't quite think the same way, right? In fact, increasingly you can have people who are scientific minded in one area but very pseudoscientific in something else, right? You could have like people, physics professors who believe in astrology and all of that. I'm just saying that human beings are complicated, and I really hope and I think initiatives such as this, first and foremost, build that empathy to say that if you want to reach an audience beyond just people who are into science, I think I would say that my editor subject saying that if you can make me read a science book as an arts and humanities graduate, then you have succeeded as a science communicator, right? And I think that's the thing. So yes, not everything can be reduced to first principles. I mean, if I'm talking climate change, yeah, I don't think I can go down to the level of start from thermodynamics and those kinds of things. Water cycle and carbon cycle. No, I don't think we'll have the time for that and so on. But still, I think use better models, use better storytelling, use humor, and I wish, like for example, I've seen science festivals in the UK. There's a guy who called Stand Up Maths, which if you like mathematics, Stand Up Maths is one of the funniest guys. He does stand up comedy about maths, and I believe it or not, it is hilarious. It is hilarious if you're a mathematician because he does throw in a lot of deep references, but it is hilarious if you hate maths because he's genuinely funny, right? And he doesn't give indication that he's talking to a mathematically sound audience or anything, right? So I think is my hope that we do more of these kinds of things and we're able to explain it at the level that a wider number of people understand some of these things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashok. And also there are quite a few other questions about documenting recipes, etc. But I'm sure if you all take a glance at the book, you will get your answers about that. But we'll draw this fireside chat to a close and hope this book inspires many people to pick up their knives and experience the experimental and fun culinary world, right? So I hope this conversation stimulated all of your senses and made you all more hungry for dinner time in India. So go grab this gem of a book and read it, and you don't have to cook every day to qualify to read this book, right? So it's written for all. And thank you so much, Ashok, for having this conversation with me. It was truly joyous and delightful conversation.
Hey, thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Suchitha and Krish, for being a part of India Science Festival. It was such a pleasure listening to this conversation, and we can only hope to host you once again in the coming years. And here's hoping that the pandemic situation gets better and we're able to host you all in an offline setting where you get to interact with our audiences on a closer level. So thank you for your time and all the efforts. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.